In the summer of 1961, a well digger named Talmadge Ledbetter set up his cable tool rig behind a farmhouse outside Kingston, Georgia, a few miles from the slow bend where the Etowah River curls past Cartersville. He was 44 that summer, a man who had learned the trade from his father and had drilled wells across Bartow County for most of 2 decades, the kind of work where a man comes to know a stretch of ground by feel, the way a farmer knows his own fields more than by any map. He was drilling a domestic well for a widow named Ruth Coggins, a routine job, the kind he had done dozens of times before, striking down through red clay, then the pale, crumbling saprolite underneath it, then the harder crystalline bedrock that sits close to the surface almost everywhere in the Georgia Piedmont. At 40 feet, the bit was chewing through exactly what he expected: decomposed granite and gneiss, the ordinary bones of that part of the state. At 60 feet, the rig stopped behaving the way it always had. The percussion bit, which should have kept biting and rebounding against fractured stone in the rhythm any experienced driller learns to read almost without thinking, met something that did not fracture at all. It gave back a flat, dead resistance, the kind he later described to his brother as dropping a chisel against a closed manhole cover. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. He worked the tool for the better part of an hour without gaining another foot, which was itself unusual, since even hard bedrock in that county generally yielded, slowly, to a patient driller. When he finally pulled the bit up for inspection, the working edge carried bright metallic streaks across it, not the dull grey scoring granite or gneiss usually left behind, but thin, almost polished ribbons that caught the afternoon light. Ruth Coggins came out from the house to see for herself. So did 2 neighbors from down the road, drawn by the sound of the rig going quiet after running steadily since morning. By evening, according to the account that survived in the Ledbetter family, at least one of those neighbors had told him plainly to stop digging. It would be dishonest to move any further into this story without saying clearly that no excavation has ever confirmed what Ledbetter believed he had struck. This account exists today in exactly one surviving letter, a handful of second-hand family retellings, and the memory of a grandniece who was a teenager at the time. It does not exist in any geological survey, any county record, or any archaeological report filed anywhere. But the physical setting he was working in was real, and understanding it matters before anything else can be weighed properly. Bartow County sits near the Cartersville Fault, the line along which the softer marble and limestone of Georgia's Valley and Ridge Province gives way to the older, harder crystalline rock of the Piedmont proper. Wells drilled near that transition sometimes behave strangely. A percussion bit striking a broad vein of milky quartz at a shallow angle can produce exactly the kind of dead, non-ringing resistance Ledbetter described, since quartz does not fracture the clean way granite does under repeated blunt impact, and quartz under friction can leave a bright, almost metallic sheen on hardened tool steel that an untrained eye, or even a trained one working from feel alone in poor light, could mistake for something else entirely. That is the explanation a geologist would reach for first, and it may well be the correct one. It is worth being just as clear that it is not the explanation the neighbor reached for, and it is not, according to the family account, what he meant by telling Ledbetter to stop. Cable tool drilling, the method Ledbetter was using that afternoon, was already an older technology by 1961, on its way to being replaced across much of rural Georgia by faster rotary rigs. But it remained common for shallow domestic wells in the Piedmont well into that decade. Since it required less capital equipment and could be run by a small crew, sometimes a single man and a helper, using a heavy steel bit repeatedly raised and dropped on a cable to pulverize rock at the bottom of the hole, the debris then bailed out by hand between strokes. Drillers who worked that method for years developed a genuine, if informal, expertise in reading what the ground was doing purely through the sound of the cable and the feel of the bit's rebound, the same way an experienced mechanic can diagnose an engine by ear before ever opening the hood. Ledbetter's neighbors in Bartow County knew him as a careful, unhurried tradesman, not a man given to exaggeration, which is part of why the family retelling of that afternoon carries the weight it does within the family itself, whatever weight it may or may not deserve outside it. A driller with a reputation for embellishment produces a story nobody bothers passing down for 60 years. A driller known for saying only what he actually saw produces exactly the kind of quiet, undramatic account that survives in a single letter rather than in the newspaper. The land Ledbetter was drilling sat within 4 miles of the Etowah Mounds, one of the largest and best-preserved Mississippian ceremonial centers anywhere in the American Southeast. An early account of the site was published as far back as 1861, when the Georgia antiquarian Charles Colcock Jones described the mounds in his survey of the state's ancient monuments, decades before any formal excavation began there. The complex itself was occupied in overlapping phases from roughly the year 1000 to somewhere in the middle of the 1500s, and at its height it held 6 earthen mounds arranged around a central plaza on a wide bend of the river, the whole precinct enclosed by a borrow ditch dug entirely by hand, and a wooden palisade whose post holes archaeologists later mapped in careful, evenly spaced rows across the field. Mound A, the largest of the 6, rises to a height of roughly 63 feet, a scale that still catches visitors off guard, since most arrive expecting a modest rise in the ground, and instead find themselves looking up at a stepped earthen platform nearly as tall as a 6-story building, raised without draft animals and without metal tools, one woven basket load of soil carried up a ramp at a time, across generations. A later excavator named Warren King Moorhead spent a season working at the site in 1925, recovering additional burials and artifacts from Mound C and publishing his findings through the Phillips Academy in Massachusetts, adding to a body of material that by the middle of the 20th century had already made Etowah one of the most thoroughly documented Mississippian centers in the country. The people who built it were part of what archaeologists now call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, a network of related Mississippian chiefdoms stretching from the Mississippi Valley up into the Appalachian foothills, bound together by shared iconography, shared ceremonial objects, and long-distance trade routes that carried marine shell up from the Gulf Coast, mica down from the mountains, and copper from sources hundreds of miles to the north. That copper is the part of the record bearing most directly on Ledbetter's account, because it is the only verified metal ever recovered from the ground he was standing on. In 1883, and again the following year, an excavator named John P. Rogan opened Mound C at Etowah under the direction of Cyrus Thomas, who was running the mound survey for the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology, one of the first systematic, government-funded archaeological programs conducted anywhere in the United States. What Rogan found inside Mound C, buried among an extraordinarily rich set of burials, included a group of hammered copper plates known today, after their excavator, as the Rogan plates. The largest and most reproduced of them shows a costumed dancing figure in profile, wearing a hawk or falcon mask, an ear ornament shaped like a stylized eye, and a bellows-shaped apron. A design repeated with small regional variations across Mississippian sites as far away as Spiro in Oklahoma and Moundville in Alabama. A shared visual language stretched across a continent's worth of separate chiefdoms that otherwise had no common writing system connecting them at all. The plates were not cast, and that distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. They were raised by repoussé, a slow technique in which a thin sheet of native copper is hammered from the reverse side against a carved wooden or resin form until the design stands up in low relief on the front, then finished with fine incised detail worked directly into the front face. It is patient, skilled, cold hammer metalworking, and it required copper soft enough to be worked without splitting, meaning the smiths had to anneal the metal repeatedly, heating it gently and letting it cool between hammering sessions to relieve the internal stress that would otherwise cause the sheet to crack under the mallet. The falcon dancer imagery on the Rogan plates is not decorative in any casual sense. Scholars working on Southeastern ceremonial complex iconography, including the archaeologist F. Kent Riley, have connected the recurring hawk and falcon imagery across Mississippian sites to a shared cosmological framework, sometimes called the Path of Souls, in which raptorial birds served as intermediaries between the living world and an upper world associated with the dead. Their speed and their high, circling flight read as a kind of literal passage between those two states. A copper plate showing a man costumed as a falcon was not simply a badge of office or a piece of personal adornment. It was a religious object, produced through a technically demanding process, using material moved across a continent, worn or displayed in a context tied directly to how that society understood death and what came after it. That is the kind of investment, in material, in skill, and in meaning, built into the copper tradition at Etowah, and it is the standard against which any claim about an unknown metal object on the same stretch of river has to be measured. Trace element studies conducted on Mississippian copper artifacts, including material recovered from Etowah itself, have consistently pointed toward a Lake Superior origin for much of the raw metal, the same native copper deposits that fed the ancient mining pits on Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula centuries earlier, moved south through a trade network that by the time of Etowah's height had already been carrying copper and the specialized knowledge of how to work it across the eastern half of the continent for well over 1,000 years. What the Rogan plates represent is not an isolated technical accident produced by one gifted smith working alone. It is the visible endpoint of a continental supply chain, a system organized and reliable enough to move raw material 1,000 miles overland, and skilled enough to turn it into ceremonial regalia fine enough to bury with the dead as a permanent marker of status that outlasted the individual who wore it. What that system never produced, as far as any controlled excavation anywhere in the interior southeast has ever confirmed, is bronze. Bronze is not simply worked metal in the way the copper plates are worked metal. It is an alloy, copper deliberately combined with tin in carefully controlled proportions, and the deliberate combination is the entire point, because tin bronze is significantly harder than either pure copper or pure tin on its own, holds an edge far better, and behaves differently under both the hammer and the casting ladle. Producing it requires either direct access to tin ore, which does not occur naturally anywhere within the documented Mississippian trade sphere, or access to already alloyed metal originating from somewhere that did have tin, which would represent contact with a metallurgical tradition entirely outside anything the archaeological record currently supports. No verified pre-contact bronze artifact has ever been recovered from a controlled excavation context anywhere in the interior southeast. The copper technology documented at Etowah, and at every other major Mississippian center studied to date, is native copper, worked cold or gently annealed, never smelted from ore, never deliberately alloyed with anything. That is not a small gap or a passing footnote in the museum record. It is close to the strongest negative finding in North American archaeometallurgy, confirmed repeatedly across every trace element and metallographic study that has gone looking for an exception and failed to find one. This is the gap Ledbetter's account sits inside, and it deserves to be described with precision, because an investigation that pretends to more certainty than the evidence allows, in either direction, has already stopped being an investigation. If what he struck at 60 feet was in fact a broad quartz vein, as the local geology along the Cartersville Fault makes entirely plausible, then there is no gap at all, only an ordinary drilling incident dressed up over 60 years of retelling into something stranger than it ever was. If, on the other hand, what he struck really was worked metal, and the family account is specific, that the shavings he brought up were kept afterward in a coffee tin on a shelf for years, bright enough that his niece remembered them decades later as looking more like nickel than the dull iron scale a driller usually saw on his tools, then the honest position is that nothing in the currently verified archaeological record of the region explains what a hammered bronze surface would be doing 60 feet underground on a farm 4 miles from Mound C. It does not fit the copper tradition documented at Etowah, which never involved alloying of any kind. It does not fit any known post-contact industrial use for that depth or that particular location, since no mining, foundry, or utility work is documented anywhere near that parcel before 1961. It simply does not have a slot in the record as the record currently stands, and the honest thing to do with an account like this one is to say so, rather than to force it into a shape the evidence does not support. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What happened to the account after that summer is its own kind of evidence, because almost nothing happened to it at all, and the reasons why are traceable to specific, named institutions rather than to any vague, general climate of disbelief. The University of Georgia had established a formal department of anthropology only a few years earlier, built substantially around the work of Arthur Randolph Kelly, known professionally as A.R. Kelly, who had directed the large Works Progress Administration excavations at the Etowah Mounds in Macon during the 1930s, and later became Georgia's first state archaeologist. By 1961, Kelly's department was the closest thing Georgia had to an institutional address for a report like Ledbetter's, and according to the surviving family letter, Ledbetter did write to it, care of the university, describing what he had found and offering to show the site to anyone who wanted to come look for themselves. What makes the silence that followed harder to explain away as simple distance or general indifference is that in those very years, a University of Georgia-affiliated archaeologist named Lewis Larson was actively leading excavation seasons at Etowah itself, only a few miles from the Coggins property, under an arrangement with the National Park Service to prepare the site for its eventual designation as a state and national historic landmark. There was, in other words, a working archaeological crew from the exact institution Ledbetter had written to, digging in the same county, in the same river valley, in the same general span of years his letter is dated. No member of that crew, as far as any surviving record shows, ever made the short drive out to see the Coggins well. Larson's seasons at Etowah in that period were substantial in their own right, uncovering additional log-lined burial chambers within the mound complex, refining the chronology of the site's occupation phases, and mapping sections of the Borrow Ditch and Palisade line that had not been fully documented in Rogan's or Moorhead's earlier work, all of it building toward the site's opening as a state historic park later in the decade. It was, by any measure, a well-staffed, well-funded, professionally supervised excavation, exactly the kind of resource Ledbetter had no access to when he tried to describe what he had seen in his own well. The imbalance is not a matter of one report being more credible than the other on its merits. It is a matter of one investigation having an institutional home, a budget, and a publication pipeline already built around it, and the other having none of those things, only a private letter and a family willing to keep it. There is a reasonable, unglamorous explanation for that silence, and it deserves to be stated plainly rather than treated automatically as proof of concealment. A university excavation team already committed to a demanding, federally supervised dig schedule at a site of confirmed national significance had limited practical reason to divert staff or time toward an unverified private report of metal shavings from a residential well, phoned or written in by a driller with no formal archaeological training, describing a find that had already, by its very nature, been destroyed in the act of retrieval, since a percussion well bit does not preserve stratigraphy, only debris. This is, in fact, the ordinary and defensible institutional posture toward reports of this kind, and it is worth measuring against a case from the same state, decades later, where the opposite happened, and the contrast between the two is instructive. In 2012, a real estate agent and self-published writer named Richard Thornton published claims that Track Rock Gap, a documented Native American petroglyph site in the Chattahoochee National Forest in Union County, Georgia, actually contained the ruins of a lost Maya city, complete with stone walls and agricultural terraces he attributed to refugees fleeing a collapsed Mesoamerican civilization centuries earlier. The claim received wide, largely credulous media coverage, including a segment on a national cable network, before it was formally and publicly refuted. Mark Williams, an archaeologist at the University of Georgia who had actually surveyed the stone features in question, stated clearly and on the record that the walls were documented agricultural terraces and rock piles associated with historic-era farming activity, not Maya construction of any kind, and the United States Forest Service, which manages the land, issued its own public statement rejecting the Maya interpretation outright and affirming the site's well-documented Native American origin and ongoing cultural significance. The difference between the two Georgia cases, Ledbetter's Silent Well and Track Rock Gap's loud, public refutation, has little to do with which claim turned out to be true. One generated enough public attention to force an institutional response. The other generated almost none and died inside a family's private correspondence instead of surfacing in a university press release. Silence and refutation, in this pairing, come from the same institutional calculus, a calculus that measures first whether a claim is loud enough to demand an answer, and only afterward, if at all, whether the claim deserves an actual look. The Track Rock Gap episode also shows how quickly that calculus can move once a claim clears the volume threshold. Within weeks of the initial coverage, both Williams and the Forest Service had issued detailed public corrections walking through the actual survey history of the terraces and the documented Cherokee and earlier use of the gap itself, a level of institutional engagement that took days to arrive once national media attention made the story impossible to ignore. Ledbetter's letter never had that kind of audience, and so it never received that kind of answer, correction or otherwise. It simply sat, unread by anyone with the authority to investigate it, for 60 years. Ledbetter's own account of what happened next comes down through exactly one surviving document, a letter he wrote to his brother, a merchant marine stationed out of Savannah, dated in October of that same year and preserved by a grandniece who eventually donated a small collection of family papers to a local historical society in the 1990s. In it, Ledbetter describes capping the original bore rather than pursuing it any further, partly because Ruth Coggins needed a working well before winter set in and could not afford to keep paying for further drilling on a hole that had stopped producing water, and partly, in his own words as the letter records them, because he had gone as far down as he cared to go without any clear idea of what he would be opening if he kept at it. He moved the rig roughly 30 feet east and drilled a second well without incident, one that supplied the Coggins house for the rest of its working life as a residence. He kept the tin of shavings. According to the grandniece's later recollection, passed down to her by her mother, he carried a portion of it to an assayer in Rome, Georgia, sometime the following year, hoping for a proper composition analysis. What he received back was a verbal opinion, never a written report, that the sample was consistent with a copper alloy, but that the shop simply did not have the equipment on hand to determine what it had been alloyed with, or to rule out contamination introduced by the drilling equipment itself during retrieval. No formal chain of custody exists for that sample today, and none ever did. The remaining shavings, by the family's account, were eventually lost in a house fire sometime in the 1970s, along with most of the Ledbetter family's other papers from that earlier period, a loss the grandniece described, in the one interview she gave a regional historian in the 1990s, as the thing she regretted most about the whole story, more than any unanswered question about what her great-uncle had actually found. What the letter preserves most clearly, in its final lines, is closer to a personal conviction than a claim of established fact, and it deserves to be read carefully for exactly that reason, because Ledbetter himself never asked his brother, or anyone else, to believe more than what he had actually experienced firsthand. He wrote that he did not think what he had struck was natural rock, and that he did not think it was junk somebody had buried at some point in the past either, because in his own experience, buried junk does not sit perfectly flat, and does not test the same at the same depth in every direction the bit touched it. He wrote that he had come to believe it was something laid down there on purpose, a long time before anybody now living, and that he had decided it was not his business to dig it up further on a widow's water budget, with winter coming and a family of his own to feed from the work he still had lined up for that season. That is the entirety of the surviving claim, filtered through one letter, one family's memory, and 60 years of careful, occasionally embellished retelling. It does not identify who built what he believed he had found. It does not offer a culture, a date, or a stated purpose. It states only that a man who had drilled wells across that county for most of his working life encountered something at 60 feet that behaved differently from anything else he had ever hit in 20 years of doing the same job, and that he chose, deliberately and for his own reasons, not to pursue it any further. The Coggins property changed hands twice after Ruth Coggins's death in the early 1980s, and the original capped well sits today somewhere beneath what current county tax records simply describe as improved pasture. Its exact location no longer marked on any surviving document, and not precisely recoverable from the family correspondence, which measures distance from a farmhouse that itself no longer stands. No formal survey has ever been conducted on that parcel. No ground-penetrating radar study, no test excavation, and no permission request from any university archaeology department appears in any public record for that land, then or since. The only physical trace of what happened there in 1961 is the letter itself, held now in a small historical society archive in Bartow County, filed under general family papers rather than under any archaeological accession number, available to any researcher who submits a formal request to view it, and read, at most, by a small handful of local historians in all the decades since it was donated. 4 miles away, on the same river, the confirmed metalwork recovered from the same broader landscape sits under museum glass, fully documented and endlessly examined. The Rogan plates are today divided between the Smithsonian Institution's collections in Washington and the Visitor Center at the Etowah Mounds historic site itself, where originals and careful reproductions rotate through display depending on ongoing conservation needs, catalogued, trace element tested, photographed from every angle, and cited repeatedly in the archaeological literature for well over a century now. The gap between that plate resting safely under glass, its origin and technique fully documented down to the likely Lake Superior source of its raw copper, and the tin of shavings that burned in a house fire before anyone with the right equipment ever tested it properly, is the entire shape of this story. One object survived long enough and drew enough institutional attention early enough in its history to become a permanent part of the documented record of what this stretch of the Etowah River holds. The other survived only as long as one letter and one family's willingness to keep it, never revisited with the instruments that exist today, never followed up on by the very university whose crew was working the same valley that same summer, its precise location now folded back into ordinary pasture grass above a well casing nobody has opened since the year John F. Kennedy took office. Talmadge Ledbetter himself died in 1989, having spent the rest of his working life drilling wells across the same county, without, as far as any surviving record shows, ever encountering anything like what he hit that afternoon in 1961. He is buried in a small cemetery outside Kingston, a few miles from both the capped well and the mound he never visited, according to his grandniece, though he told her once, near the end of his life, that he had driven past the Etowah site more than once over the years, and had thought about stopping. He never did. What he had struck, whatever it was, stayed a private matter for him, in a way it never became for the objects Rogan pulled out of Mound C, objects that were photographed, published, and placed in glass within a generation of their discovery. Whatever is or is not sitting at 60 feet beneath that pasture remains exactly where it was the afternoon Talmadge Ledbetter chose not to go any further, undisturbed, unverified, and, for now, simply still there, 4 miles from the plates the Smithsonian was willing to keep. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.